Hi everyone, my name is Beverly and I am an alcoholic. And we know that Friday night and Saturday morning we had speakers up here that sounded like they were recovering alcoholics. But last night and this morning I think what we got is two sex maniacs. I'm very proud to stand here before you this morning and tell you that I'm a recovered woman alcoholic, because this wasn't the case a little over 24 years ago. I stood in a mental institution at that time, and I had been out on one of these little excursions that they let you go out on occasionally if you've been on good behavior, and they were serving alcohol aboard the boat. And the rest of the patients were drinking it, so I assumed it was okay. And needless to say that when I got back from that little excursion, I was quite drunk. And they kept me downstairs for a little while trying to sober me up before they took me back up on the ward. And when I got up there, there was one woman on our ward that was being treated for a thing called alcoholism, and I had never heard of that before. And when I got back up there, this woman followed me into my room. And she looked at me and she said, "Beverly, I think you're an alcoholic." Well, I want you to know I have never been so insulted in my life. And I told her in no uncertain terms that she needn't lay her thing on me, that by God, I was crazy. And the sad part of it is that I really meant it. I would rather have been known as crazy than to have been called an alcoholic. Now, I come from a little town in Florida, or at least it was little when I was growing up. And I had two older brothers. And I can't remember what the occasion was, but I do remember that Daddy had said to us kids, he said, when you're old enough to go to work and can afford to buy your own cigarettes and your own booze with, as far as I'm concerned, you're old enough to drink and smoke. Well, hell, needless to say, I went to work at an early age. Now, along about that same time, I was about 13 then, the war came along. Now, for you young people that are here today, I want to tell you that was the Second World War, not the first one. I want to get that straight right off. Now, by the time I was 16 years old, I was a blackout drinker, and I was pregnant and married, just in that order. Now, I know that today, you know, if you got to get married, being pregnant is as good a reason as any. But in the day when I was growing up, nice girls just didn't do those things. Now, you got to remember, I also said that I was a blackout drinker. Would you believe that I was 4 months pregnant before I even knew I'd been had? I'm not just saying that, it's the truth, so help me. I was doing waitress work, and I was very sick in the mornings, and I decided that it was maybe I should get to a doctor. And when he finished examining me and I went into his office, he looked over at me and he said, "Beverly, you're pregnant." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, Dr. Moses, I can't be. I've never been with a man." Well, he assured me I was not the second Virgin Mary. I did marry that young man, and there were two things in that marriage that were very important to me, two special events. They were important to me in my drunkenness and in my sobriety. Now, I have found that all of my life there have been two main things that have motivated me to take an action, and that has been fear and pain. Always been my greatest motivators. Now, in that marriage, there was one particular occasion that stands out in my mind. He had come home one night, and for whatever the reasons, he had a bottle of beer in his hand, and it was a full bottle, and he struck me across the mouth with that bottle of beer. And the only thing that I could remember was that I was spitting teeth and blood. And the next thing I remembered, I was on my knees in front of the bedroom door, and I had the handle of a butcher knife in my hand. And I looked up that door, and there was two pieces of that knife in that door. He was behind it. And that frightened me so bad that without knowing it at the time, what I did was that I made a commitment that I would never ever get angry again, because you see, at that moment in my life, getting angry meant I might kill somebody. So I began to suppress anger. This man drank a lot, and I had gone to the doctor. I had lost the first baby, but I had gotten pregnant again about 5 years later, and I had gone into the doctor, and my nose was sitting sidewise on my face, and I had a couple of black eyes, which was par for the course. But anyway, this doctor had said to me, he said, "Beverly," he said, "why don't you leave this man?" He said, "He is an habitual drunkard." Now, I never heard the term or the terminology alcoholism when I was growing up or during those years. He called him an habitual drunkard. And I had a baby that was 6 weeks old at this time, and I thought that maybe this man was right, you know. I really did not want my child raised in that drunken kind of an atmosphere with that drunken father. Get that. Look where I am today. Didn't want her raised there. And anyway, so I decided to leave him. Now, I did what we in alcoholics now call, I took a geographic. I moved from Florida out here to California. Now, in better-known circles, that's known as unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. We had a few bills that were outstanding at that time. Now, when I came out here to California, I returned to what I called social drinking. But you see, when I left that man, I thought I still loved him. I was only leaving him because I didn't want my child raised that way. And I spent 2 years rocking, crying, cussing, and praying. And again, without recognizing what I was doing. I made a vow that I would never, ever love anybody that much again, because you see, loving someone meant too much pain, and I didn't want to go through that pain again. So I began to suppress pain. So at the early age of 22, I had buried two of the strongest emotions that a human being can have, one of anger and one of love. Now, you got to remember that I said that this baby was only 6 weeks old when I left him, and I am a very, very slow learner. But when I learned my lessons, I learned them well. And one of the things that I learned coming out of that marriage is that you don't go to bed with a man first. You get married first. Well, by the time this child was 4 years old, I got to tell you, it had been a long, dry summer. And I decided that she needed a father and that I needed a husband, somebody to help bring home the bacon, carry out the garbage, girls. You know what that is. And anyway, I met this young Irish Catholic boy. And we decided to get married. I fell in love again. Now, we all know that Irish Catholics are alcoholics. Hell, they're all here in Alcoholics Anonymous, you know. Would you believe that I married the only Irish Catholic that didn't drink? I don't know how I did that. Well, he kept interfering with my drinking. One of them had to go. We know which one it was. Anyway, I got to tell you about Mama, because Mama was very important in my life, and I know that there are a lot of girls here and women who had a lot of bad problems in their relationships with their mother. I was very, very lucky. My mother and I had a very close relationship. Mama had a lot of cliches. Now, we read all these cliches when we come in here into Alcoholics Anonymous, but I knew all about them because my mama used to have them all the time. And I remember that she was very instrumental in me going to work at the age of 13, and it was because of one of these cliches she had. It was idle hands or hands of the devil, you know. And I guess she figured by putting me to work, you know, that would keep me out of trouble for a little while. And it did, as I said, until I was at least 16. But anyway, Mama had another cliche, and when I went through this second divorce, I remembered that she had told me, she said, "Honey, if you don't succeed at first, try again." So Mama was coming out of her fourth marriage as I was coming out of my second one. And we were back together again. You see, Mama just didn't say cliches. She lived them. She really believed in them. Just like we do here, you know. And anyway, we had come home from work one night, and we were sitting around there, and I had just put the baby to bed. And Mama looked over at me, and she said, "You know, honey," she said, "I think we ought to get ourselves a business." She said, "to ensure Charlotte, my daughter, a more secure future." Well, heck, it sounded like a good idea to me. So we got a business. A liquor store. Now, what I haven't told you was my mama was an alkie, too. So the fun began. Now, by this time in my life, I was into the morning drink. And I had found that when I got up in the morning, I was also a moving drunk. When I got up in the morning, I found that by taking another drink or two, that I could keep going during the day. The only thing that was happening now was that instead of being able to go during the day, I was now going from sick to drunk again with the morning drink. I don't know whether you've gotten that far with yours or not. And I didn't quite know what to do about it because I had a lot of responsibilities. I had that child to take care of, and I had a lunch job downtown, and I was working the liquor store 10 and 12 hours at night, and I had to keep functioning. And along about this time, I fell in love again. Now, what I was really doing was falling in heat, but I didn't know that then. Now, this third man that came in my life introduced me to a thing called a barley sandwich. You don't know what a barley sandwich is. Let me tell you what a barley sandwich is. See, I wasn't eating too much about that time, and a barley sandwich is beer and tomato juice, and you get your booze and your vitamins at the same time that way. Doesn't sound good? Honey, it didn't really taste good, but you see, it worked. And really, that was all I was interested in at this time, is did it work? Because you see, by now, alcohol was the only consistent thing in my life. Husbands came and went. Jobs came and went. But alcohol was consistent. Now, I did marry this man. And, about a year or so after we got married, this morning drink, now, this one was beginning to not work with me too well. And I began to have some funny symptoms. And I remember one morning getting up to go to work, and I was making the bed, and I was smoothing out the bedspread, and it was wet. And I couldn't quite figure out what it was, so I snuck and reached down up underneath it to see how the mattress was. You know how that goes. And the mattress was dry. Well, I couldn't figure out how the top of the bedspread got wet. But I didn't have time to think about it, you see, because I was a moving drunk. And I had to get to work, so I went on into the bathroom and I went to wash my face, and I looked up in the mirror, and the water was just streaming down my face. It was like somebody had turned on 2 water faucets. Well, hell, I had a fixer. I just went on into the bar, got myself a couple of hookers, and water just shut off, and I went on in and finished getting dressed and went on to work. And the next day, I remember coming home from work, and I got into the living room, and all of a sudden, the pit of my stomach was just starting to jump, and within just a few seconds, my whole body was just jumping all over that house. Well, hell, I had a fixer, and I knew what would do it, and I just bounced on into the bar, got myself a double hooker, and man, everything just calmed right down, and I went on in and fixed dinner. But I remember the next day, I had laid down for a nap, and when I woke up, I was on the floor. And I vaguely remembered that something like this had happened before. And this time I was scared. And you got to remember, I told you my 2 main motivators was fear and pain. And I was filled with fear. And I got myself into a doctor, and they examined me there medically, and then they sent me down to the psychiatrist, and they sent me over to this one. And they came to the conclusion that I was having epileptic seizures, and I was in the midst of a nervous breakdown. Now, you and I both know that what I was having was alcoholic convulsions. But they didn't seem to know that, and I sure didn't know it. And anyway, this is how I got to UCLA in that NPI section up on that 5th floor. Now, I would like to tell you that when this woman came to me and called me an alcoholic, that I really took that to heart. But I didn't. In fact, I was so insulted that I went into my psychiatrist, and I told him, I said, you know what Lenore had to say to me? She called me an alcoholic. I said, now, what do you think about that? Why, he looked over at me, and he says, no, Beverly. He said, I don't think so. He said, if you can just learn to face reality. And you can just learn to cope with some of your problems. He said, I can't see where you have any problem with alcohol at all. Well, hell, he was the boss. When I got out of there, I went into private therapy at his recommendation. And I also told this psychiatrist what this woman had said to me. And again, I was told, if you can just learn to face reality, and you can just learn to cope with your problems, I see no problem with alcohol. Well, I was to drink for another 3.5 years after that. Now, I can see that a few of you here have been to this nut house. Maybe not that particular one, but one like it, because I see a lot of heads going like this. Now, if you've been into a psychiatrist, you know that when you begin to face this thing called reality, we do it. You know, you don't do it by yourself. We do it. Well, when I began to face reality, I drank. I don't know what that poor guy did, you know. And when I started learning to cope with some of these problems that I had, again, I drank. I don't know how in the hell he coped, but you see, I had been doing that ever since I was 13 years old. That was my way of facing reality. That was my way of coping with my problems. Now, I've heard it said here in Alcoholics Anonymous that we have that moment of clarity, and I want to tell you about mine. And as I stand here today, the things that I tell you are the things that I have learned from this big book of Alcoholics Anonymous that apply to me. Now, they tell me that in here what it says applies to all alcoholics. But I don't know how you're going to work it. I can only tell you how I have applied it in my life. And I'm not standing up here giving you a bunch of opinions. I'm giving you a bunch of my experiences. The night that moment of clarity came to me, I was in my home in Chatsworth. And I had been trying to stay away from the drink all day because my husband had been saying things to me like, why don't you learn how to drink like a lady? Well, hell, I had been drinking like a lady. You know, I don't know what his problem was. I don't ever remember of falling off of a bar stool like some of these drunken women did. I fell a few times getting up on them, but I never fell off of them. I remember that my mother had said to me one time, she said, honey, she said, I really think you ought to cut down on your drinking. Now, Mama was sober at this time, and I looked over here and I said, yeah, Mama, I think we both ought to, you know. And then I remember when my daughter was quite young, and I'd come home from work and I'd get that drink fixed, and my daughter would come in and she'd stand there in the kitchen and she'd reach over and she'd get a hold of my glass and she'd say, Mama, do you really have to have that? And I'd look at her and I'd say, yeah, honey, I'm just going to have this one. Now, you go on out and play, and I'm going to fix dinner. And I remembered by the time this night had come along that I was sitting in my home in Chatsworth, my daughter was 14 years old. And she still came in when I came home from work to fix that drink, and she'd look up at me and she'd say, do you have to have that? And that love and concern that had been in her voice when she was younger was no longer there, and she looked at me with one of pure hatred and disgust. But you see, she didn't understand. I had to have that drink. I had to have it. So I had really tried to quit drinking several times in my life. But I sat there this night waiting on this husband to come home, and he was late as usual. And I was trying not to drink. He had already begun to mark the bottles, and we had a nice little bar and a great big party room and the whole thing. In fact, this particular week, he had even stooped so low as to cut off the CO2 on the beer on tap, and I thought that was stooping pretty low. But I didn't worry about it too much, you see, because I had my own particular supply. And I've got to tell you gals, and this is just for you gals, so you guys can just turn off at this point. There is going to be some scouts in this group here today. You don't know what a scout is? Let me tell you what a scout is. You remember the old Western movies we used to have? In fact, they show them sometimes on TV now. And the wagon trains coming out here to the west, and they always have a scout for those wagon trains that they send out there to see if there's any Indians out there, to see whether it's safe for them to proceed on ahead. Well, what we have in here today is going to be some scouts. And that's going to go out there, and they're going to see if there's any Indians out there for us. And let me tell you, if you're going to be one of those scouts, let me tell you about this place that I found to hide my supply that nobody ever found. They found all the rest of them, but they never found this one. When I found this little hiding place, I started off with a 12-pack size, and it held a half a pint in there for me. And by the time I got here to Alcoholics Anonymous, I had found the 48 size pack, and I could get 2/5 in that. And what that was a box of Kotex. They never found my supply, and that way I had one coming and one going all the time. So I never had to worry about what that son of a gun did. Now, I don't know why I had to hide him, because Mom and I still owned the liquor store, you know. Anyway, I couldn't wait any longer this particular night, and I had myself a drink, or two or three, however many it was. And anyway, he came in a little while later, about 8 o'clock I guess it was, and he looked over at me, and he said, "You're drunk." Well, he had me. I don't care whether he said you're drunk or crazy, he had me on both counts. Anyway, with that, he walked on up into the bedroom and passed out. Now, I don't know whether that man was an alcoholic, but he sure had a drinking problem, I'll tell you. Anyway, I was sitting there, and I'd fixed myself another drink. And I remember walking into the kitchen and looking out the kitchen window to the front driveway, and those 2 new cars were sitting in the driveway. And I walked through my beautiful new home, and it was beautiful to me. And I remember walking on out into the backyard and raising my head up and saying, "Why, God? Why now? When I've got everything I've always wanted, why do I want to die?" And you see, I couldn't have told you the answer to that then. Today I can. What good is all you've got if there is no joy in it? And you see, by this time in my life, alcohol had taken all the joy out of my life. It had taken me into a living hell. It had just taken away my soul, if you will. And I think that Christ said something like that when he said, "What profits a man who gains the world and loses his soul?" And you see, that's what had happened. There was no joy in my life at all. Now, I remember going back in the house and fixing another drink. And it was at that moment when I knew it was not that man that I was married to that had taken me into this living hell. And you see, up until that time, I always thought it was that man that I was married to, or that job I had, or those neighbors or friends or whoever, you know, that was keeping me so upset all the time. And right there at that moment, I knew it was the alcohol. Also, at that very moment when I knew it was the alcohol that had taken me into this living hell, I knew I couldn't stop drinking. Now, what do you do when you know you can't keep on drinking and you can't stop drinking? I did the only thing I knew to do. I killed myself that night. Now, I say that, and I say it facetiously. But you see, for me, I believe that that's what really happens. Our book talks about being reborn again, and that doesn't mean any of you have to go out and commit suicide. It just simply means that that's the way it was for me. Because when I woke up 3.5 days later, and I couldn't figure this one out because I woke up in County General Hospital. Now, I lived in a little town of Chatsworth, and that was a long way from County General Hospital. It wasn't until about a week or so later that I found out how I got from Chatsworth to County General. Did you know that committing suicide is against the law? I didn't know that. And in fact, Don Gates came up to me one night, and he said, "Beverly," he said, "committing suicide isn't against the law. It's only attempting suicide that's against the law." I didn't know that until Don told me. Oh, God. Anyway, this psychiatrist that I had sent word to me at the hospital, and I got out under his care, and I went up to see him, and he said, "Beverly," he said, "you need help, and you need it desperately." And he said, "I can't help you." I thought, "Well, you son of a bitch, why have you kept me coming here for 3.5 years? And beside that, I darn near killed myself." He said, "I went to some open Alcoholics Anonymous meetings," and he said, "I liked what I heard there." And he said, "I picked up some of their literature, and I liked what I read." And he said, "I think these people can help you." He said, "Here's their telephone number. Will you call them?" And again, I looked over at him, and I thought, well, I know it won't work, because you see, by this time I had tried all the things that the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous talks about. I'd tried the churches, I'd tried husbands, I'd tried quitting for my daughter, and all of these things, you know, and nothing had worked for me. But I thought, well, I'll try it. And if it doesn't work, I'll just kill myself again. And I took the number from him, and when I went on home that day, I called. Now, my 12-step call went something like this. She said, She didn't say, are you an alcoholic? I'm very grateful for that. She said, Beverly, are you having a problem with alcohol? Well, hell yes, I was having a problem, you know. And she said, are you drinking now? And I said, no, not right at the moment. And she said, well, can you hold on for a little while and I'll send somebody out to talk with you? And I said, well, if you make it quick. So I got my house all spiffied up and got myself all spiffied up, and while I was doing this, I kept thinking, you know, I couldn't hardly wait for those gals to get there, whoever it was that was going to come, because I wanted to tell them about that son of a bitch I was married to, because I was sure when I was able to tell them what he was like, they would understand why I had to drink. Now, they came to the house, and every time I opened up my mouth to tell them about what he was like, they'd start talking to each other. Well, they were there for 2 hours, and I never got to tell them anything. They just kept talking to each other and telling me all about their life. Well, finally, I guess they got ready to go, and they looked over at me, and they said, Beverly, we want you to be ready at 8 o'clock. We're going to go to a meeting and come by and get you. They never even asked me if I wanted to go. Yeah. Well, I got ready, and they came, and we went. Now, on the way to the meeting, they said to me, Beverly, don't try to identify with how much people drink, but try to identify with what alcohol did to them. Where did it take them? So I told them, okay. Now, when I got into this place where it was we went, why is it that they always have Alcoholics Anonymous meetings way back somewhere where you can't find it, you know, and it's dark, or it's in a dingy dungeon of a church, or, you know, and I didn't know where these women were taking me, and it occurred to me that I didn't even know them, you know. A lot of strange things going on in this world. But anyway, I remember getting there, and you people started talking about a thing called a disease of alcoholism. And I heard things like it's a killer disease. I thought, God, you know. But I knew I couldn't stop drinking, and yet when I looked at you people and I seen the smile on your faces and I seen that look in your eyes, and you told me that if I had this disease, that you could show me a way up and out of the living hell that I was in, but that I had to find out for myself whether I had this disease or not. And so I began this search to find out what this thing was, this disease of alcoholism. And I went to my doctor and I asked him, well, he didn't know a lot about alcoholism. So I went to my psychiatrist. Well, he didn't know a hell of a lot about it either. So I came back to you people, and you told me you had a big book in here called Alcoholics Anonymous, and it would tell me about the disease of alcoholism. So I got into the book and I read it, and I would go to these meetings and I would talk to you about this disease. And I found out I had it. And I thought, well, I'm a son of a gun. You know, most of us don't have this disease until we get here and kind of mix up with you people, and it kind of rubs off on us. I had a drinking problem when I got here, but not the disease. So anyway, I wanted what you people had. And you told me it was in this big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, this is not my book. This is my mama's. I gave mine to an ex-father-in-law, and he died with it, drunk. But I gave it to him anyway. But, you know, I carry this book with me because I always carried my bottle with me when I was drinking. And I carried it with me for a reason. I was afraid if I didn't have it, I'd get struck sober. So I always carried my book with me when I got sober because I was afraid if I didn't have it, I'd get struck drunk. Now, I got one of these sponsors because that was what I was told to do. And she was one of those kind of sponsors that says, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Jesus. Y'all identify with that, huh? She was a whip boy, I'll tell you. And I can't remember what the occasion was, but I do remember we were sitting around at one of the tables after a meeting, and she used to get a little disturbed with me every once in a while. And she looked over at me and she said, Beverly, she said, I want you to know if you decide to get drunk, I must have been threatening her with getting drunk. A few of you people have done that occasionally. And she looked over at me and she said, if you decide to get drunk, I want you to know I'm not responsible for that. Well, I looked over at her and I figured, well, all right, you know. And she got up from the table and turned around and looked back down at me and she says, and by the way, I remember you're suicidal too, and I want you to know I'm not responsible for that either. Well, now, I looked over at her and I said, well, you're my sponsor. What the hell are you responsible for then? You know, God. They got to be good for something. And she walked over and she picked up my big book and she held it up like this and she said, I'm responsible for helping you to learn what's in this big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and how to apply it to your daily life. Well, I thought about that for a little while and I thought that means I'm going to have to do something here. Now, you see, I had never realized it at that time, but up until then, I had always had a boss. And you see, that's what I thought she was, that she was going to tell me what to do and how to do it, and I would just do what she said, and I'd be all right. Because when I got to looking on it, I thought, well, Mom and Daddy had been my boss. And then when I started going to school, my school teachers had been my boss. And then when I went on to work, my boss told me what to do. And then when I was old enough to get married, I married a boss. Right? And she told me that wasn't the way it worked, that I was going to have to be responsible for my own actions. So I figured, well, if that was the case then. So she got me into this book, and she said, Beverly, she said, when you go to women's stag meetings, she said, and you hear a woman talking, and you like the way that their life is, I want you to go up to them after the meeting and get their name and their telephone number. And she opened up my big book here on the first page, and she marked it in red. She said, now you get these women's names because it's very important, and she specified women. Now, I don't know how many of you were here and heard my husband talking, but he gets up to these podiums and he brags about having an IQ of 160. Well, now my comprehension is just a little bit below average. But I want you to know, you heard him tell it last night. It took him 3 months to learn about the first page of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is blank. Well, I learned about the first page and that it had nothing on it when I first got here, so I don't think you're so damn smart. Anyway, I went up to these women after the meetings, and I got their telephone numbers. Now, the reason she had me do this, because she said, Beverly, she said, if you get in trouble, or you're hurting, or whatever is happening, you call these numbers. Well, I remember one morning I got up, and I don't know what or why, but I just started shaking, and I had the sweats. And I tried to get in there and get busy, and I couldn't even get the dishes done. And so I remembered what she had told me, and I remembered I had this emergency page, and I had it filled with these women's names. So I thought, well, I'll follow directions, and I'll do what she said. So I grabbed my book, and I don't know about you, but, she had me put it in my book because every time I'd write people's names down, you write it on just whatever's at handy, and then you can never find it when you need it. And having it in my book, I could always remember just to go to the first page in the book. So anyway, I grabbed my book and I went over to the telephone and I started calling because I just knew I was going to get drunk. Well, I called the first number and the line was busy. So then I called the second number. She was just on her way out the door. And I called the third number. There was no answer. Well, that went on, and I called that whole darn page full of telephone numbers, and not one of those women had time to talk to me. Now, the funny thing was, though, is by the time I got to the end of the page, hell, I'd forgotten what I called for. It was time for a meeting, and so I just grabbed up my book and went. Now, what I'm trying to tell you is that this program works. Now, it doesn't matter how it works, but the thing of it is that it works. Now, also, she told me, she said, Beverly, now, when you're reading your book, she said, and you come to something in your book that's important to you, she said, mark it. I said, no, I don't mark books. They're expensive. She said, mark it. I marked it. She also went over to the second page, blank page, honey. And she said, write the number of the page on there, and she said, write a little short synopsis about it. Now, I don't know whether you've heard it or not, but I have a little secondary problem running around in my story. I know that you're not going to identify with this, but I have found since being here for a little while that we come in here, both men and women, and I don't care whether you're 6 or 96, we come in here with two primary problems, bad breath and a broken heart. booze and sex, if you will, plain language. And I began to recognize that I had that problem. Now, I found something else out. You know, in this book, it says we have found a common solution. And when I started reading this book, it told me, it said, a lack of power is my dilemma. And to find this power, greater than myself, that can solve my problem, is exactly what this book is all about. Said we have written a book which we believe to be moral as well as spiritual. Now, I don't know what that says to you, but I can tell you what it said to me. I don't believe that my drunkenness was a moral issue. I believe my sobriety is. And so I began to work on that premise. Now, they talked about a spiritual way of life. Now, I don't know how you were when you got here, but I was kind of iffy with this God bit. And I remembered reading something, and it went something like this. I would rather live my life as though there was a God and die and find out that there wasn't, than to live my life as though there was no God and die and find out that there was. And so I thought about that for a little while, and I thought, well, you know, I'd better, because they kept saying act as if. So anyway, I started out on what to me was my spiritual program. Now, I know that many people, when they come in here and they hear that word spiritual, it kind of bothers you. Well, they told me to keep it simple, and the simplest connotation that I could get, I was also taught to use a dictionary, and it says, spiritual is an elevation of thought and feelings. You see, I thought it had to do something with a church and a religious doctrine. Elevation of thought and feeling. I thought, well, now I can buy that now, and my sponsor said, keep it simple, so I said, okay. So you see, that's the way I started, and when I came into the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I simply wanted to become a better person. And once I put aside that alcohol, that's what I was doing. Just automatically, I started becoming a better person. Now, when I began to put this program together for me, I remember thinking to myself, to become a better person, what do I want to become? You know, the first step says that we admit we're powerless over alcohol and that our lives is unmanageable. Hell, I knew that. When it came to the second step, and it said, came to believe that God could restore us to sanity. You know, a lot of people had trouble with that, but I had no problem with that at all. I had a certificate stating I was insane, you know, so that one was no problem. And when I was about 3 years sober, I had gone through a divorce. And that was when this little secondary problem began to crop up. I remember one of the first things I was taught is that we get a good, firm, basic program, and we don't get emotionally involved, and we stay away from these dirty old men. Right, girls? Were you taught that? Now, you know, you guys are smiling here. I can remember when I first came in, I used to hear it said a lot about you guys, and I know that some of you were taught, you know, to watch out and stay away from these dirty old women, you know, because behind every slip there's a skirt, right? Don't you laugh, honey, because behind every slipper there's a zipper, too. That goes two ways. Goes two ways. And I gotta tell you, that, you know, another thing that I've noticed about you. You know, girls, I don't care from what walk of life you come from. When you come in here, you are reborn. You become a virgin again. Second chance at life. Now, I know this to be true because I've watched you guys, and you're watching the girls. And when they came in, you can't hardly wait to be the first one in their lives, right? Right, guys? I've seen you do it. And what you really ought to be trying to do is to be the last one in their life, not the first one. You see, when you can learn to love the hell out of a woman instead of the hell in one, you're going to be making it. And that's what you guys go for. You keep going for these hellish women, and that's what you keep getting. Huh, Ron? Anyway, I had gone through this divorce, and this little secondary problem cropped up, and I didn't quite know what to do about it, and I was teaching these babies the same thing I had been taught. And I told them, I said, you know, an alcoholic's mind, when it begins to sober up, it's one of the most beautiful things you ever seen. It just begins to click. You can see it going. And I had 3 years of sobriety by this time, and mine was beginning to click. And here was this secondary problem, and I was in heat, and I didn't quite know what to do about it. And I had these babies of mine, and I was teaching them the same thing as I'd been taught, is that you get a good, firm, basic program, and you stay away from these dirty old men. Now, I just changed that a little bit. I told him, but if you need to get laid, that's all right. Now, the reason I told them this is because I figured if they could go out and get laid without getting emotionally involved, they could come back and tell me how, and I'd be okay, right? Hell, it made good sense to me. Well, I got to tell you that not one of them have come back and reported how. Not even some of you guys, you know. And I thought that a man, you know, didn't have any problem that way, that he could just get in and out of these relationships and just walk away scot-free. Well, I have had the privilege of working with some of you men since I've been married to Hugh down here, and I've held some of you in my arms when you've had to walk away from some of these relationships. And I've seen that it hurts you too. You don't walk away scot-free. And that's good to know for me and for you gals out there. You got to remember that when you're practicing your programs and some of these little affairs you're having. And of course, I didn't have that problem. However, I remembered to go back to my book, and I got back up in here. I remember calling my sponsor up, you know, and she'd say, well, Beverly, the answer's in the book. Do you know why they tell you the answer's in the book? Because they don't know where in the hell it's at in the book. You know, I didn't know that for a long time. I finally figured it out. It took me about 7 years to figure that one out. Got to remember, my comprehension's a little below average. Anyway, so I remembered when I was in trouble, and I was in trouble, I was in heat again, and I was afraid. You see, and fear and pain had been my strongest motivators. And I was filled with fear again because, you see, I figured if I got laid, I'm just liable to get drunk. So I went back to this book, and I opened up the page, and I was looking here on this blank page, honey. You know what my first number is in this page? Page 69. It's where they write about sex. Dirty book, I kid you not. I couldn't believe it. It talks about sex there. Well, I read it. And then they also told me for every problem I had, there was a solution in this book. So I turned the page on over, and over on page 70, there is a solution. It says in here, if we are truly sorry for what we have done and have asked God to take us on to better things, we believe we will have been forgiven and will have learned our lesson. But if we are not sorry and our conduct continues to hurt others, we are quite sure to drink again. We are not theorizing. These are facts out of our own experiences. Well, now, I don't know what that does for you, but those are pretty strong, potent words to this girl. And it put the fear of God in me again. And again, I got back into this program. And I started thinking again. You know, and I used to call this sponsor of mine, and I knew what she was going to say to me before she said it. And I was all upset, and sure enough, I called her this day, and she said it. But I was ready for it. She said, Beverly, have you gotten quiet? Have you meditated? Well, have you ever tried to get quiet and meditate when you're flying up your own ass? There is no way. Just no way. And you see, when I get emotionally upset, I can't think. I am totally unbalanced. But I was ready for it, and I told her, I said, Bunny, if I could have gotten quiet and meditated, I sure as hell wouldn't have called you, you know. But anyway, I got back into this book again. And by this time, I was really in trouble, and I remembered reading something in this other book, the bigger one. And To the best of my memory, it said something like this. It said, God was talking. It was in red. I remember that. And it said, I have created man in my image, and for man I have made woman, and woman is to follow man. Now, I thought about that for a while, and I thought, hell, I followed 3, you son of a gun, and look where I ended up at. Nut House and Alcoholics Anonymous. Something was wrong somewhere. And I didn't quite know what to do about it. So I thought about that for a while again. And then, by accident one day, I found it in the Bible. And sure enough, it said, I have created man in my image. And for man, I have made woman. And woman is to follow man, and man follows God. Now, I don't know about the rest of you people, but it had never once occurred to me to follow a man who followed God. Never thought. I started looking back over it and writing one of these little inventories on it, and I didn't quite know what to do about it. So I thought about that for a while again. And then, by accident one day, I found it in the Bible. And sure enough, it said, I have created man in my image. And for man, I have made woman. And woman is to follow man, and man follows God. Now, I don't know about the rest of you people, but it had never once occurred to me to follow a man who followed God. Never thought. I started looking back over it and writing one of these little inventories on it, and I thought about the kind of man I chose and followed. One with charm, polish, and prestige. After all, that was only befitting. Right, girls? One that was fun-loving, party-going, woman-chasing, hard-drinking. That's the kind of man I got. I didn't want what I got when I got it, but that's what I got. And you see, I didn't realize it. And then I went back into this other big book of mine, and I started reading it, and I remembered something in there that I had read, and sure enough, it said what I thought it said. So our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. They arise out of ourself, and the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, though he usually doesn't think so. Above all, we alcoholics must get rid of this selfishness. We must, or it kills us. God makes that possible. Wow. Hit me like a ton of bricks. Scared the living daylights right out of me. And you see, again, I knew I had to take an action. Now, I began to look back into my program and to do some inventorying again. And it's been talked about here earlier. And the message we have been given here in Alcoholics Anonymous is a message of love. And this is especially for the newcomer here. And especially for the women, because I think that they have a little bit more of a problem than the men do in this particular area. And the kind of a life that some of us have led during our drinking years, and the guilt and the shame that's been behind it. A message of love. And if there is a theme here in Alcoholics Anonymous, I think again that it is the theme of one drunk helping another. And in that we form a relationship. And isn't that a relationship of love? And isn't love God? And isn't God spiritual? And isn't that the message of Alcoholics Anonymous? That's what I have found. I've talked here today about the pain that I have felt. You know, I call my beginning years, and I'm talking about my first 5 to 7 years, the agony and the ecstasy. I was either way up in the heights of heaven or way down into the pits of hell. In our book here, again it says, and for the newcomers, it says, cling to the thought that in God's hands, your darkest past is the greatest possession you have. For with it, it is the key to life and happiness. And with that key, we avert death and misery for others. And we do that by sharing our stories, one with the other. And that is our message. It showed me the way up and out of a living hell that I was in. You people gave me that. There was another thing that was important to me, and it's just a couple of lines in the book, because you see, when I got here, as I said, I was married, and after 3 years I went through a divorce. And I don't advocate divorce, and if you've seen here earlier in this weekend, you've seen 2 marriages that have been very, very strong. But for me, it wasn't to be that way. And I went through that divorce, and I went through 3 years of being single after that. And I want to tell you people that I know what it is to walk into a meeting alone. In the daytime, that's fine. Walking out of it's no problem. It was at night, and especially on the weekends. And God knows that Sunday was the worst day of all. And I would walk into those meetings at night alone, and that was okay. It was when I walked out of them alone at night and went home alone. That god-awful loneliness. Oh, that god-awful loneliness. And I would go to these meetings, and these women would say, Beverly, go to the source. And I would go home at night, and I would wrap my arms around myself, and I would say, God loved me. And I knew he did. And I was taught to use you people. And after 3 years of being single, I met my present husband. Now, Hugh and I celebrated our 14th wedding anniversary here last Wednesday. So I want to tell you that there's hope not only for sobriety, but for life after sobriety. And we were married when I was 6 years sober. And I got to tell you right here and now that this man, when he gets up and talks to you, he's just not talking. I got to tell you, he lives his program. And you see that that's got to be that way. You can read this book, and it's vitally important that you read it, because in reading it, is how we learn. But reading it just isn't enough. You can even memorize it, and you can get up here like I've done today, and you can spout it off in podiums, and you can spout it in meetings. But that isn't enough either. You see, it says the spiritual life is not a theory, we have to live it. There is no cure for the disease of alcoholism, and the disease of alcoholism is a terminal illness. I've got a pet peeve, and I got to tell you about it before I get down from here this morning. And I hear it so many times at these meetings. They'll get up here and they'll say, today I no longer have a drinking problem. Today I have a living problem. God, I don't know about you, but if you're an alcoholic of my kind, when you hear somebody say that, get the hell away from them. Don't walk, run. I came here almost 20 years ago, and I came here because I was an alcoholic and I had a killer disease. And I got to tell you that no matter how much I talk about emotional problems, today I am still just as much of an alcoholic as I was the day I walked in here, and the day I ever forget that, I'm just liable to be back on that juice again. There is no cure for the disease of alcoholism. What we have is a daily reprieve contingent upon our spiritual condition. That's the reason it's so important for you to remember that this is not a theory. You have to take it and take it into your daily life and put it into use, or it has absolutely no value. And here in Alcoholics Anonymous, I don't care, even the strongest of the believers here, some days we have our doubts. I know I have. But you see, in this book it tells us precisely, exactly, and it even goes on to say clear-cut directions. And in working these steps, if we follow those directions, it shows us the way to have faith. And if we take these steps as we're directed, hell, we can't fail. We have living proof here. We have a proven method here in Alcoholics Anonymous that if we use this faith in our daily life, it works. There is absolutely no room for failure in here if you apply it. And that's what we have to do. It will only work if you work it. Now, as I said, Hugh and I was married when I was about 6 years sober. And the first thing that happened is we got married in September, and before Christmas of that year, he was in a car accident and was almost killed. He hadn't got upon his feet yet, and we got a call, and his mother had passed away, and we buried her. And shortly after that, I was involved in a car accident. And I had just gotten home from the hospital on Saturday, and I got a call that my mother had had a stroke. Now, Mother lived 2 days after her 62nd birthday. But the most important thing in the world to my mama was that 3 days before she died, she celebrated her 5th Alcoholics Anonymous birthday. And for that, I am so extremely grateful. And I know that she was too, because she voiced it. And I buried my mother. And it seemed like if that life could go wrong, it did go wrong. I've lost my father, my brother, and I have a niece now that's only 27 years old that's dying of cancer, and she has 2 small children. You know, and the most wonderful thing is that about every 2 or 3 weeks, Mary Beth will call me up and she'll say, "Annie Beverly, can I come over and spend a day or 2 with you? Just being with you just makes me feel so good." You know, I couldn't have offered her that when I came here to this program. Hell, she was just a young kid then, and she really didn't want anything to do with this aunt of hers. And what I'm really trying to tell you, the message that I'm trying to carry to you this morning is that don't do like I did. I came into Alcoholics Anonymous and I thought, hell, if I'm going to get emotionally well and then I'm going to be okay. And that's not what our book says. It says that when the spiritual malady is overcome, we will then get well physically and mentally. When the spiritual malady is overcome. Well, as you heard, I've walked through a lot of happiness. I've walked through a lot of sadness, joys, angers, frustrations. And as I close here today, I want to wish for each and every one of you all of the joy, all of the sorrow, all of the happiness, the angers and the frustrations. Because you see, these things are life. And life to me is right here in Alcoholics Anonymous. Thank you very much.